They told her never to work for a man like Reese Calloway, and every one of them was right, but not one of them had a sick little girl at home and a drawer full of unpaid medicine bills. At 34, Reese ran the Calloway family the way his father had before him, with a quiet grip on the shipping docks of Baltimore that everyone in the city understood, and nobody dared say out loud. He had a waterfront estate full of rooms he never walked into, a line of black cars in the drive, and more money than most men could spend in 10 lifetimes. What he didn't have was a single person left who'd meet his eyes across a room. 3 years earlier, a car meant for him had taken his wife Diane and their little girl instead. And after that, he sealed off an entire floor of the house, carried a scar along his jaw he never explained, kept his voice low and his shirts pressed, and let one loyal old man named Otis keep the lights burning while everyone else slipped quietly away. Because working for a man that cold asked more than most people were willing to give. So when he finally needed someone to cook in that silent house, the notice went out softly through a church near the harbor, and only one person was desperate enough to answer it. Maeve Sullivan was 28, red-haired and freckled, a single mother who'd walked through a cold Baltimore rain with her daughter's hand tucked in hers to take a job. The whole neighborhood begged her to turn down. She'd been a restaurant cook in Philadelphia until the kitchen burned to the ground, and she knew exactly whose door she was standing at. She looked at the most dangerous man in the city dead in the eye and told him the whole town had warned her off, but the whole town had never had to choose between its pride and its child's medicine, and something in the plain honesty of that made Reese step back and let her in. She came to cook his meals. She never once planned to save his life, but one evening, with steady hands and a cook's careful eye, she caught something in his glass that every loyal man he owned had somehow missed, and the moment she reached across that table and stopped him from drinking, everything changed. Because a man who trusted no one had just discovered there was one person in the world he couldn't afford to lose, and that, far more than any threat or any enemy closing in, is the real reason Reese Calloway wouldn't let her walk away. If a story about second chances, hard-won trust, and the strange way a broken house slowly learns to feel like a home again is the kind of thing you love, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's step back to that cold night in Baltimore, and the knock on the door that neither of them saw coming. The door closed behind her with a soft sound, and Maeve Sullivan stepped into a silence unlike any she had ever heard in any house she had entered before. The great hall stretched out before her with a soaring ceiling and a chandelier suspended in the darkness. Not filthy, not at all. Everything had been carefully cleaned in the manner of a place still being looked after. Yet it carried the look of something long forgotten, like a ship anchored out in the bay with its lights still on but no one left on deck. The air inside the house was a little colder than it was outside, a coldness that did not come from temperature but from absence, from the closed rooms along the hallway that she could feel more than see, from the thin layer of dust the eye might miss but the heart recognized at once, the dust of days passing by without anyone truly living here. Penny clutched the hem of her mother's coat tightly, her round eyes lifting toward the towering ceiling, and Maeve placed a hand on the child's head by instinct, the gesture of a mother who had learned long ago that sometimes the only thing she could give her child was the steadiness of her own hand. Reese stood a few steps away, watching her as she watched his house, and for a moment neither of them said anything, as though each was waiting for the other to speak first. Otis appeared from a side doorway, his gait leaning slightly to one side because of the leg that had followed him through so many years, carrying a tea tray no one had asked for, and he set it down on the small table with the quiet thoughtfulness of a man accustomed to caring for people who did not know how to care for themselves. Reese pointed toward the leather chair across from the fireplace, where the fire had long since gone out, and Maeve sat down, drawing Penny into her lap, keeping her old worn bag beside her like a soldier, guarding the last of her possessions. He did not circle around things. He asked where she had cooked before, how long she had worked, why she had left, and she answered each question plainly, without adding, without embellishing, telling him about the kitchen in Philadelphia that had burned to the ground on a winter night, and about the months afterward when she had taken whatever work people offered, as long as it gave her daughter a roof and the pills that the child's small chest needed. Reese listened in the way Maeve gradually understood was his nature. No nodding, no interruption, only looking directly and letting silence do its work. And there was something in that attention that made her understand this man weighed every word before he spoke, and that whatever he did say was what he truly thought. When he named the salary, she nodded, without bargaining. because the number was fair, fairer than anywhere she had ever worked, and that told her more than the words he had not said. But then she placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and looked at him with the calm gaze she had forged through years that had not been gentle to her, and she said there was one thing she needed to make clear before taking the job, that she was not looking for a temporary shelter only to be pushed back into the street a few weeks later, that she needed real stability, not for herself, but for the child sitting in her lap, because the little girl was already tired enough of moving in the middle of the night and waking up in strange rooms, and if he could not promise that, she would rather stand up and leave now than let her child put down roots in a place only to be torn out again. There was a silence after she spoke, and Maeve realized that no one spoke to this man that way. Not because they were afraid, but because most people wrapped their words in something soft to dull the edge of the truth, and she did not. She simply said exactly what she thought. Rhys looked at her for a long time, then said in the low voice that had become his habit that if her work was as she had just described, then he saw no reason for that to happen, and she understood that this was his way of saying yes. She stood, lifting Penny into her arms when the little girl had begun to doze, and Otis led mother and daughter up the polished oak staircase, past closed doors Maeve did not ask about, until they reached a room at the end of another corridor, unexpectedly warm, with a small fireplace already lit as though someone had known ahead of time that she would come. She laid Penny on the bed, pulled the blanket up over her, then straightened and turned to leave, and it was then that her eyes stopped at the far end of the opposite hallway, on a door unlike all the others, a door with an added lock on the outside, locked shut, as if meant to keep something inside or keep everyone else out. She had not yet had time to ask when Otis was suddenly standing behind her, and he followed her gaze, something she could not read passing across his old face, and he only said, very softly, almost in a whisper, that she should not concern herself with that room. Then he turned and limped back down the stairs, leaving Maeve standing alone in the silent hallway, with the feeling that this house was keeping something behind that locked door, something she did not yet know, but somehow already understood she would have to touch sooner or later. On the first morning, Maeve woke before the sun had even touched the bay, and she went down to the kitchen while the whole house was still sunk in its sleep. That long, endless sleep she had begun to suspect had lasted for 3 years. The kitchen appeared before her in the pale gray light of dawn, and she stood still at the threshold for a moment to look at it carefully, like a mechanic standing before a machine that had stopped running for too long, judging how much work it would take to make its gears turn again. This was a kitchen that should have been the heart of a great house, spacious, fully equipped, with copper pots hanging from racks and a large stove strong enough to cook for 30 people, but everything was covered in the dull film of disuse, cabinet doors stuck from damp, a faucet dripping steadily into the sink like a clock counting months no one had bothered to count. And in the pantry there was a poverty that hurt to see. A few boxes of dry goods, a few things long past their dates, traces of a man who had decided that eating to stay alive and eating as if life mattered were two things that had nothing to do with each other. Maeve rolled up her sleeves and began, not rushing, not complaining, only working in the way she always had, one section at a time, one thing at a time, because she had learned long ago that the only way to face a task too large was to stop looking at all of it and look only at the thing directly in front of her. She scrubbed the stove until the black iron began to shine again, cleared the clogged flue that she was certain had gathered enough grease to become a danger waiting to happen, wiped every cabinet shelf, threw away what had spoiled, and wrote down what was missing, and she did all of it with such quiet focus that she did not notice when Otis had come to stand in the doorway watching her. He said nothing for a long while, only stood there leaning against the frame, and when Maeve finally looked up and met his eyes, that old face carried something it took her a moment to recognize. It was relief, the relief of someone who had waited a very long time for something and now saw it beginning to happen. He told her it had been a very long while since anyone had stood in this kitchen at this hour of the morning, and his voice dipped in a way that made Maeve understand he was not speaking only about the kitchen. She asked how long he had been here, and Otis answered that he had served the Calloway family for nearly 30 years, first Rhys's father, then Rhys himself, and that he had stayed through everything, even the stretch of time when everyone else had gone, because he was the kind of man who had decided long ago that loyalty was not something a person put down whenever it grew heavy, and because he still believed, though he never said it aloud to anyone, that this house would find its way back to itself if only one person stayed long enough to wait. Small footsteps sounded on the staircase, and Penny appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her hair tangled, her eyes still sleepy, but already shining with the curiosity that nothing could extinguish in a 6-year-old child before a completely new place. She tiptoed inside, her fingers gliding over the wooden table, lifting her face toward the copper pots hanging overhead as though they were some kind of miracle. And Otis, the man Maeve had until then believed did not smile very often, limped toward the tin box on the high shelf, took out a butter cookie. Maeve had no idea when or for whom he had been saving, then bent down and placed it in the child's small hands with the tenderness of a grandfather who had forgotten he still knew how to be tender. Penny held the cookie in both hands, said thank you in the solemn little murmur of a child, and Otis let out a quiet laugh, the first laugh that House had heard in so long that even the house itself had nearly forgotten what such a sound was. Maeve switched on the light above the kitchen table, and warm yellow brightness spilled over the freshly scrubbed wood, pushing away the grayness of morning, and in that moment the kitchen no longer looked like something dead, but like something someone had gently awakened. But then, Penny, who could never sit still for long, crawled beneath the old china cabinet in the corner of the room to pick up a fallen crumb of cookie. And when she came back out, she held not only the crumb, but also a yellowed sheet of paper, a drawing in colored pencil made by a child's hand, a house, a sun, and 3 figures holding hands beneath a blue sky, the paper having been trapped behind the cabinet for no one knew how long. The little girl held up the drawing for her mother to see, her clear eyes looking up at Maeve and then at Otis, and in the innocent voice of a child who did not know her question had just touched a wound that had never healed. She asked where the little kid who drew this was now, and Maeve saw Otis go completely still in the corner of the kitchen, the tin box still in his hand, his face turning white, as though he had just seen a ghost step out of the wall. Otis took the drawing from Penny's small hands with a gentleness so delicate it was almost trembling, told the little girl he would keep it safe, then quietly left the kitchen before Maeve could ask anything more, and she, with the instinct of a mother and of someone who had lived long enough to know when not to press, did not follow him. She only held her daughter close for a moment, then returned to her work, because she understood that some wounds should only be touched when a person chooses to bring them into the light. All that day she worked without stopping, and by evening, when the sunset stretched long across the bay and the lights along the distant harbor began to flicker like a string of golden beads laid across dark water, the kitchen was ready, and for the first time in no one knew how long, the smell of real food rose inside the Calloway house. She did not have enough ingredients to make anything elaborate, but she did not need elaborate. She only needed real food, the kind that asked for time and care, and a little piece of the heart, a pot of beef stew with potatoes seasoned carefully, and a loaf of bread whose dough she had set to rise that morning and baked until its crust was deep gold and crisp. She set the table in the kitchen, not out of ceremony but from the simple belief that people should eat at a decent table. Then she went to Reese's study door and knocked to tell him dinner was ready. He came, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a while, looking at the table she had laid, at the steam rising from the stew, at Penny sitting with her little legs swinging above the floor, and something passed across his face that Maeve could not read. Something somewhere between astonishment and an old pain. Then he sat down, and Otis came in from outside too, taking the 3rd chair without anyone needing to invite him, as if that place had belonged to him for a long time, and they ate in a silence Maeve had prepared herself to find suffocating, only to discover that it was not quite that. A silence that was almost, in some way, comfortable. Reese ate slowly, and she noticed that he ate like a man who had forgotten food could be anything more than fuel. And after a while he set his spoon down, lifted his eyes to her, and said in his low, even voice that it had been a very long time since there had been anything on this table worth sitting down to eat. His words were not warm, not in any obvious way, and certainly not effusive. But from what Maeve had already come to understand about this man in 2 short days, she knew that sentence from his mouth was no different from thunderous applause from someone else, and she only gave a small nod, telling him that the bread would need a little longer to rise next time, that this stove ran hotter on the left side, and she saw the corner of Otis's mouth twitch as though he were trying not to laugh. Then Penny, who never allowed any silence to exist for too long, began to talk, telling them about the dog belonging to their old neighbor in Philadelphia that knew how to sit and shake hands, about how she would absolutely have an orange cat when she grew up and name it Biscuit, about the brightest star she had seen through the window of her new room the night before, and was certain was a special star that belonged only to her, and that innocent, chirping little voice kept filling the kitchen, slipping into every corner and crevice of the silence and melting it like ice beneath the sun. Maeve saw Reese listening to the child, not answering much, but not turning away either, and there was one moment when he looked at Penny with an expression so distant that Maeve almost had to lower her eyes, because she realized she was watching a man look at a child and see in her the shadow of something he had lost. The meal drifted on in that fragile warmth just beginning to kindle, until the phone in Reese's pocket suddenly rang, a cold, sharp sound cutting through the space like a blade through cloth, and she saw his whole body go still before he managed to answer. He rose, took a few steps toward the window, lifted the phone to his ear, and only listened, saying nothing for a long time. But Maeve, still seated at the table with her daughter, saw his face change, saw the darkness crawl over it slowly and unstoppably, saw his jaw harden around the faint scar at his jawbone. And when at last he spoke, his voice dropped so low that she almost had to strain to hear it, a sentence he seemed to say not to the person on the other end of the line, but to himself. "So, he has set foot back in this city." In that moment, though she did not yet know who he was, Maeve felt a chill run down her spine, the feeling of someone who had just heard the wind shift before the storm had even appeared on the horizon. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Maeve gradually came to know, waking early, cooking, cleaning, caring for her daughter, and learning to read this house the way one learns to read a book written in a language they have never known. Little by little, through small details most people would overlook, she realized that the Calloway house was not merely a house, but the center of something larger and darker. That the men in dark suits who came and went through the gate were not friends stopping by, but men coming to report. That the Calloway name was spoken around the harbor in a voice that carried both respect and caution. And that the quiet man who ate dinner with her every night was someone the whole city knew, though no one dared name him openly. She did not ask questions, did not pry, because she had learned long ago that in some places, knowing less was a form of safety. But she was not blind either. And one afternoon, when she carried a tray of coffee near Reese's study, she accidentally witnessed something that made her understand more clearly than ever who she was serving. The door was partly closed, and inside, Reese was standing across from a man taller than him by a full head. A man with broad shoulders and hands like two iron fists, yet that very man was standing with his head bowed, sweat beading on his forehead, while Reese only stood still, both hands in his pockets, speaking in a voice so quiet that Maeve could barely catch the words. She could not hear the content, but she could hear the cold edge in his tone, the absolute calm that did not ripple with even a trace of anger. And it was that calmness that was more frightening than any shouting, because it was the calm of a man who knew he did not need to raise his voice to make others tremble. She saw the large man's face go pale, saw him stammer something that sounded like a plea, then saw him lower his head and walk out, passing her without daring to look up. And Maeve quietly set the coffee tray on the table in the hallway and turned away, because she understood that there are moments when a person should not be caught having witnessed them. That evening, as she served dinner, she looked at Reese with slightly different eyes, not with fear, but with a clear understanding of the borders of the world she had just entered, and she told herself that her job was to cook and care for her child, not to judge the man who paid her wages, because she had lived long enough beside a bad man to know that judgment was a luxury people in her position could rarely afford. But it was that very evening, when she returned to the kitchen to put things away, that she truly noticed another man in the house for the first time, a man named Dale Hoffer, whom she had glimpsed a few times but had never paid attention to, a man around 40 with the patient look of someone who had served for a long time but had never been lifted into the position he believed he deserved. Hoffer was standing in the corner of the kitchen, and when Maeve stepped inside, she caught something passing through his eyes very quickly before he could hide it. Something bitter, a simmering resentment, the look of a man who had stood on the edge too long and had begun to wonder why he should have to endure it. He nodded to her with just enough politeness and left, and Maeve did not think much of it, only stored it away in a corner of her mind the way she stored everything else, until late that night, when she returned to the kitchen for the towel she had forgotten. The kitchen lights were off, but through the crack in the door she saw a small glow, the cold blue light of a phone screen, and when she gently pushed the door and looked inside, she saw Hoffer bent over beside the board where she had written the meal schedules and times, and hung them on the wall, and he was holding up his phone, secretly photographing that board, every hour, every day of the week. Maeve stood motionless in the darkness of the hallway, and a question flashed through her mind that she could not yet answer. Why would a servant in the house need to photograph the master's meal schedule, and why would he need to do it in the dark, at midnight, when he thought no one was watching? Maeve did not tell anyone about what she had seen in the kitchen that night, because she had nothing in her hands except a blurred image and an uneasy feeling. And in a house like this, a feeling was not enough to accuse anyone, much less a man who had served here for years while she had only just stepped in with wet feet. But that night opened something in her, a sharper kind of attention, and from then on she began looking at everything in the house with different eyes, the eyes of someone who had learned that disaster rarely arrived without warning, that it usually sent small signs ahead of itself, signs only those who paid attention could read. And the thing she began paying attention to, the thing that once noticed she could no longer push from her mind, was Rhys himself. She noticed that after certain meals, not all of them, but enough that it could not be coincidence, the man who always held himself so upright and alert would become unusually exhausted, his face turning gray, his hand lifting to rub his temple, and once she saw him grip the back of a chair when he stood as though the ground beneath him had suddenly tilted. At first she thought it was from overwork, from the sleepless nights she guessed he had endured far more often than nights when he truly rested. But then the professional instinct in her, the thing that had sunk deep into her blood through all those years in kitchens, began to speak, and it told her something was wrong with what this man was putting into his body. She started paying attention to everything placed before him at the table, and she noticed that while the food was made by her own hands, and she knew every ingredient, there was one thing beyond her control: the wine, the bottles Rhys still drank every evening, delivered regularly by a man, and stored in the wine cellar she was not responsible for. One evening, when she was pouring wine into his glass as usual, she happened to bring the rim of the glass near her nose while wiping a drop from its side, and she went still, because something in that scent did not belong to a normal bottle of wine, something mixed beneath the familiar fragrance of grapes, faint, almost impossible to notice. But the nose she had trained through thousands of tastings and smells knew it did not belong there. She tilted the glass beneath the light and saw a thin layer of sediment settled at the bottom, something a properly stored bottle of wine should not have had, and her heart beat faster. She remembered the night in Philadelphia, the night when the kitchen she had loved for so many years went up in flames, and she remembered standing across the street watching fire swallow the place that had once been her whole life, and she remembered people telling her the fire had started in a place where it should not have started, that if someone had paid attention to the faint burning smell in the weeks before, perhaps everything would have been different, and that lesson had carved into her a belief that would never fade, that great disasters always begin with small signs people choose to ignore. She stood there with the glass in her hand, and a terrible suspicion began to take shape in her mind, but she immediately restrained herself, because she understood exactly where she was and who she was in this house, a newly hired servant, an outsider. And if she opened her mouth to accuse someone without proof, if she planted in the ear of the most powerful man in the city the thought that someone was poisoning him, and it turned out she was wrong, then not only her job, but the fragile roof she had just built over her daughter's head could disappear in an instant. And worse, she might push an innocent person into deadly suspicion. So she decided she would keep silent until she was certain. She would quietly watch the wine delivery man, the cellar, every hand that touched those bottles before they reached this glass. She would collect, observe, and wait. But just before she set the glass down, she lifted it to her nose one more time, only to make sure she had not imagined it. And this time, when that faint smell slipped into her senses, her hand suddenly froze in midair, because she realized something that chilled her even more than the suspicion itself. She had smelled this scent somewhere before, long ago, somewhere in the past she could not yet name, but her body remembered, and it was screaming to her that the last time she had smelled this, something very terrible had happened. For the next several days, Maeve still could not trace where that scent had come from in her memory. It lingered at the edge of her mind like a name on the tip of her tongue that would not come out, and she carried that unease with her when she went to the market near the harbor on Saturday morning to buy food for the week, taking Penny along because the little girl had insisted on seeing the place her mother had described as having great big boats. The harbor market was a world of its own, noisy and alive, stalls displaying fresh fish with silver scales glinting, baskets of vegetables, the smell of sea salt and engine oil mingling in the wind, and here, among the workers and small merchants who had been tied to this harbor for generations, Maeve began to hear one name repeated again and again in a tone she had learned to recognize, the tone of people who were afraid, but trying to act as though they were not. That name was Garrett Voss. At first she only caught pieces of it. A fragment of conversation by the fish stall, a complaint near the bread counter. But the farther she walked, the more the picture came together, and that picture made her go cold. People said Voss was an outsider, a businessman wearing the polished appearance of real estate, friendly with his handshakes and sweet as honey with his words. But behind that civil surface, there was something that made the whole harbor shudder. He was going door to door through the small businesses along the docks, offering to buy them at prices so high they were absurd, so high they no longer looked like purchase offers, but warnings wrapped in gift paper. And to those who refused, he made another offer, one he dressed up with the pretty name of an insurance fee, a monthly payment made in exchange for peace, though everyone understood that this peace really meant peace from his own hands. Maeve stopped at the stall of a family named Fontaine, a middle-aged couple who sold dry goods and spices, and when she asked a few casual questions, the wife lowered her voice and told her that last week several strange men had come to their stall, buying nothing, only standing there and looking around before leaving, and the very next morning, their canvas awning had been slashed apart, their goods scattered everywhere, and they understood at once that it was the first message, the first hand on the shoulder before the fingers began to tighten. She said a few families had already broken under the pressure and sold everything before leaving. Others had clenched their teeth and paid that insurance fee, and the whole harbor had begun shrinking little by little beneath the shadow of a man most of them had not even seen face to face. While Maeve stood listening, Penny had toddled toward another stall at the end of the row, the stall of a small old woman with a slightly bent back whom people called Widow Crane, a woman who had sold coils of rope and seafaring supplies at that corner of the market for so long that no one could remember when she had first begun, and the little girl was gazing with wonder at a small wind chime made of seashells hanging in front of the counter. Maeve stepped over to collect her daughter, and Widow Crane lifted her head to look at her, those old eyes narrowing as they studied her for a moment before drifting down to the child, and something in the woman's gaze softened. She took down the seashell wind chime and pressed it into Penny's hands, refusing firmly to take any money, saying it suited the little girl. Then she turned to Maeve, and her voice suddenly dropped. She asked whether Maeve worked in the big house by the bay, and when Maeve gave a slight nod, something crossed the old woman's face, something caught between pity and caution. She said she knew that house, knew the man who lived there too, and that in these times, being near the Calloway name was not much safer than being near the Voss name, because when two large beasts began fighting over a piece of land, the first ones crushed were always the small creatures trapped between them. Then she looked around, as if making sure no one was listening, and leaned toward Maeve, lowering her voice until it was almost a breath, telling her to be careful, to watch every person coming and going from that house, because this man Voss was not like anyone she had ever met. He was not merely buying land or buying peace, he was buying deaths too, and she said that with such cold certainty that Maeve stood stunned, and before she could ask what the old woman meant, Widow Crane had already turned away and begun hurriedly packing up her stall, her hands trembling, as though she herself had been frightened by the words she had just spoken. Widow Crane's warning followed Maeve all the way home, and she carried it into the great house by the bay, the way a person carries a grain of sand in a shoe. Small, yes, but never letting her forget it is there. And she began to understand that the name Voss she had heard in the market and the sentence Reese had spoken by the window on that interrupted evening were perhaps the same thing, two ends of the same rope being slowly pulled tight. She did not have to wait long to know that she had guessed correctly, because only a few days later, on a gray afternoon when a thin veil of mist lay over the bay, a car she had never seen rolled through the gate, a sleek and expensive car, and from it stepped a man around 50, dressed with careful precision, a designer coat, the unhurried stride of someone accustomed to entering places where his presence was welcomed, with two men flanking him, their faces blank in the way of men hired to remind others of their master's power. Maeve knew at once that this was Voss, without anyone needing to introduce him, because that polished, courteous appearance fit everything she had heard, and she felt a cold current pass through her when he lifted his gaze toward the house, with the eyes of a man appraising an object he was certain would one day belong to him. She was ordered to bring coffee into the drawing room, and because of that she was in the room long enough to witness the first moments of the meeting, long enough to see Reese stand, to receive his guest but not offer his hand first. A small detail she noticed made the smile on Voss's lips pause for an instant, before he managed to adjust it back into place. She set down the tray and withdrew, but she lingered in the hallway longer than necessary, and through the partly closed door she heard most of what unfolded inside. Voss spoke in the smooth voice of a master salesman, praising Reese's estate, praising everything the Calloway family had built over the years, then turning toward the real reason he had come, an offer he dressed in the elegant name of consolidation. He said times had changed, that the harbor district stood before a grand future only men with vision could grasp, and that it would be far wiser if the two of them, instead of fighting over it, sat together under one roof, naturally, his roof. He named a number so large that even Maeve, standing out in the hall, had to hold her breath. A price for Reese's entire network, for the docks, the warehouses, the routes the Calloway family had controlled for 3 generations, and he said that number with the confidence of a man who believed there was nothing in this world money could not buy. Reese remained silent for a long while after Voss finished. The silence Maeve had learned was his signature. Then he answered, his voice low and flat with not a ripple of feeling, that his network was not for sale, had never been for sale and never would be, and that if Voss had come all this way only to hear that answer, then he was afraid the man had wasted an afternoon. There was a pause, and then Maeve heard Voss's voice change, the sweetness falling away to reveal what lay beneath it. He said Reese should think carefully, that he had more to lose than he imagined, that this city could be a very harsh place for men who insisted on standing alone, when everyone else had already understood that standing together, or more accurately standing beneath him, was the only road to survival. He said it in the voice of a man who wanted his listener to understand 2 things at once. Advice and threat folded neatly into the same sentence, and Maeve shivered, because she recognized that he was not making an empty threat. The meeting ended quickly after that. Voss stood, fastened the button of his coat, offered a few hollow pleasantries about hoping Reese would have a peaceful winter, then turned toward the door, and it was then, as he passed the wooden shelf along the wall, that the strange thing happened. The thing Maeve would only much later understand in full. On that shelf stood a framed photograph, the only photograph still displayed on the entire lower floor of the house. A picture of Reese from many years before, younger, lighter, standing beside a gentle-looking woman and a little girl who was laughing. And when Voss's eyes moved across that photograph, he stopped. He stopped longer than any stranger should stop before another man's family portrait, his gaze lingering over the faces in the frame with unusual attention, and something difficult to name passed across his mouth, not the curiosity of a man seeing them for the first time, but a look almost of familiarity, the look of someone recognizing rather than discovering, and Maeve, standing in the hallway watching, felt her heart tighten in a way she could not explain, though in that moment she could not yet know why. Voss's strange look before the framed photograph haunted Maeve for days afterward, layering itself over her unease about the odd scent in the wineglass that she still could not name, until one evening, all those scattered pieces suddenly struck against one another, and she understood that the time for hesitation was over. That afternoon, while she was preparing dinner, a wine delivery man she had never seen before arrived. Not the familiar face who usually came, but a strange man with restless eyes and an unnatural hurry in every gesture. He set the crate of wine down, glanced around the kitchen as if measuring something, then left faster than necessary, without lingering to chat the way delivery men often did. Maeve watched him go, and the instinct that had saved her many times in life began screaming in her chest again. She opened the crate, took out the bottle of wine designated for that evening's dinner, and when she poured a little into a glass to prepare it for the table, she saw it again. The thin layer of sediment settled at the bottom, the faint smell slipping beneath the scent of grapes. Only this time it was stronger, clearer, no longer a passing trace but a presence. And in that moment, standing alone in the kitchen under the yellow light, her memory finally opened. She remembered where she had smelled that scent before, remembered an afternoon many years ago when an old friend who worked in medicine had shown her a vial of a substance people used to harm others slowly, silently, little by little until the heart collapsed, and no one thought of poison. The blood in her body went cold. She no longer had time to weigh things, no longer had time to fear her place in the house, or whether she might accuse someone unjustly, because upstairs, Penny was sleeping soundly in her warm room, and down here, the man who had given them both a roof was about to lift that glass to his mouth. She carried the tray into the dining room with hands she had to fight to keep from trembling, set the plate of food down before Reese, and she saw him reach for the glass, saw his fingers close around the stem, saw him lift it from the table, in a gesture so familiar, it was almost unconscious. And when the wineglass began to tilt toward his lips, Maeve did not have time to think. She only acted. She reached across the table and caught his wrist, stopping him right there, firmly and decisively, the liquid trembling and nearly spilling over the rim. The whole room seemed to freeze. Rhys lifted his eyes to her, and for an instant she saw in them the cold astonishment of a man who had never been touched that way, never been stopped by anyone, and she knew that if she was wrong, this would be her last moment in this house. But she did not pull her hand back. She looked straight into his eyes and said, softly but steady as stone, that he mustn't drink it, that there was something in that wine, that she had smelled it and she was certain, and she begged him, just this once, to believe her. There was a silence so long it seemed it would never end, the two of them looking at each other across the table, and then Rhys set the glass down, very slowly. He called for people, and when that liquid was sent for testing that very night through connections only a man in his position could command, the result came back, confirming what Maeve had said. There was poison in the bottle, a sophisticated poison calculated to kill a person gradually over many weeks, without leaving behind any trace beyond the appearance of a heart that had simply stopped beating from exhaustion. The strange delivery man was hunted immediately, and when he was caught the next morning, he revealed connections leading straight back toward Voss, sending every arrow in only one direction, and Rhys had the man dealt with in his own way without a single question. But what Maeve would remember forever about that night was not the poison, not the arrest, but the moment right after she stopped his hand, when the two of them were still standing silent beside the table with the deadly glass of wine between them. Because the first question Rhys asked her, the first question that came from the mouth of a man who had nearly died, was not who had done this to him, not who had dared poison him inside his own house, but something else entirely, a question that left even her stunned. He looked at her, and he asked in his low voice, now carrying something she had never heard in it before, "How did you know? How could you know something everyone I trust had missed?" And in the way he looked at her then, something had changed, something that was no longer the gaze of a master looking at a servant. Rhys's question hung suspended between them all that night, and Maeve answered him honestly, telling him about the nose trained through so many years in kitchens, about the scent her body had recognized before her mind could name it. And he listened to her in silence in his own way, not interrupting, only watching her with that new searching look, as if he were trying to understand who she was, who the real person standing behind the apron of a cook truly was. The next morning, after the house had settled from the shock of the night before, Rhys called her into his study, and she stepped inside with a heaviness in her chest, because she had thought all night and had reached a decision. She told him, before he could even speak, that she thought it was time for her to take Penny and leave this place. She said it not because she was ungrateful, but because of exactly what had happened, because now she had seen with her own eyes how dangerous the world she had accidentally stepped into truly was, and she had a child to protect, a child who had only her in this world, and she was not sure she had the right to place that child between the lines of a war that was not hers. She said it softly, and for one very brief moment, so brief almost no one could have caught it, something passed through her voice, a hesitation, a tearing inside her that even she did not fully understand, because part of her had begun putting down roots in this house in a way she had not allowed herself to admit. But Rhys shook his head, and he told her something she had not considered. He said it was too late for her to think about leaving safely, because the man who had poisoned him surely now knew that his plot had failed, and he also knew why it had failed. He knew there was someone in this house who had seen what no one was supposed to see, and in Voss's world, a witness was not something people left alone. He said that if she left now, alone with a child, with no protection, she would not get far, and he could not let that happen. Maeve understood the cold truth in his words, understood that the very act of saving his life had made her and her daughter targets, that she had unknowingly closed with her own hands the door she had just meant to walk through, and she stood there, feeling the invisible circle tightening around her. Yet even as he said all those cold things about safety and danger, Maeve still felt there was something else beneath his words, something he did not say, and perhaps had not yet admitted even to himself, the real reason behind his insistence on keeping her there, and the way he avoided her eyes when speaking of her leaving betrayed him more than any words could have. She agreed to stay, not because she had no other choice, though it was true that she did not, but because some part of her wanted to stay, and that left her both confused and afraid, because she had sworn to herself long ago that she would never let her heart depend on a man again. From that day on, a hidden tension began to exist between them, an electric current running beneath the surface of their ordinary exchanges, the tension of two people who both knew something was taking shape between them, but both were too careful, too scarred, to dare touch it. That night, after the whole house had sunk into sleep, Maeve woke because Penny was thirsty, and as she walked down the dark hallway toward the kitchen, she stopped because she saw him. Reese was standing at the far end of the opposite hall, before the locked door Otis had told her not to concern herself with, the door she had never seen anyone open, and he stood there alone in the darkness, wearing only a shirt, his head slightly bowed, and she saw him slowly raise his hand and place it on the doorknob. He stood that way for a very long time, his hand resting on that cold knob, his whole body motionless as a statue. And Maeve held her breath and stepped back into the shadows, feeling that she was intruding on a moment too private to be witnessed. She saw his fingers tighten gently around the knob, as though he were gathering all his courage to open it, to step into the room beyond and face whatever waited for him there. But then, after a long while that seemed endless, that hand trembled faintly, then let go, falling to his side, and he turned away in silence, leaving the door still locked as it had been locked for 3 years, while Maeve stood still in the darkness, her heart tightening around a question she did not dare speak aloud. What in the world was behind that door that a man who seemed to fear nothing did not have the courage to face? A few nights later, after dinner was finished and Otis had withdrawn to his room, and Penny was fast asleep upstairs, Reese remained in the kitchen longer than usual, sitting at the wooden table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him, and Maeve realized he was waiting for something, trying to find a way to say something he was not accustomed to saying. She kept cleaning, not rushing him, because she had come to understand that this man was like a rusted door. The harder one tried to pry it open, the tighter it closed, and it would only open when it was ready. At last he spoke, and the question he asked was one she felt he had been holding inside for many days. He asked her why she had done it, why she had saved him. He said she knew very well who he was, that she had been in this house long enough to understand what kind of man he was, to hear what people said about him at the harbor, to see with her own eyes how he could make a larger man lower his head with only a few words, and he said most people, if they had been in her place, might have quietly let that glass of wine do its work, might have seen the death of a man like him as a relief for the city rather than a loss. Yet she had stopped his hand, had placed herself in danger to preserve a life many would say was not worth preserving. He asked her why, and there was no challenge in his voice, only a sincere bewilderment, the confusion of a man who had lived too long in a world where every action carried calculation, until he could no longer understand an act done for no gain at all. Maeve set the cloth down, turned to look at him, and thought for a moment before answering, because she wanted to say what she truly thought, not what would be easy to hear. Then she told him that she did not weigh a human life by the work a person did, or by the rumors that followed them. She said she had seen enough in life to know that people were far more complicated than the labels others placed on them, that she had not been standing there to judge whether he deserved to live or die. That was not her place, and it was not anyone else's either, and that when she saw a human being about to drink something that would kill him, she stopped it, as simple as that, not because he was Reese Calloway, or because he was anyone in particular, but because he was a human being, and a life was a life, no matter whose body carried it. She added, more softly, that perhaps he should try looking at others that way sometimes too, seeing them as human beings before seeing them as pieces on a board, because she suspected it had been a very long time since he had done that. A long silence followed her words, and Maeve saw something move across his face, something cracking very softly in the steel shell he had worn for so long, as though her words had touched a place in him no one had reached for a very long time. He did not answer, only sat there looking down at the cold coffee, but she knew those words had entered him and would remain there, and when he rose, said good night, and walked out of the kitchen, there was something different in the way he moved, a little lighter, like a man who had just been allowed to set down some part of the burden he carried. The next morning, while Maeve was alone in the kitchen, Otis limped in to make his morning tea as usual, but instead of remaining silent as he always did, he stopped beside her, and he looked at her for a long while with the knowing old eyes of a man who had watched this house for 30 years. Then he said quietly that he had seen the way the young master looked at her, had seen what she perhaps had not yet realized, that she was the first person Reese had truly trusted since that day, the first person in 3 full years. Maeve looked up, and something in the way he pressed those words, that day, made her uneasy, and she asked him what day he meant, what had happened 3 years ago. Otis fell silent for a moment, his hands trembling as he set the cup down. Then he looked at her with a deep sorrow rising in his eyes, and he asked her in return, in the low, hoarse voice of a man about to open something that had been buried too long, whether she truly knew nothing about what had happened to the wife and the little daughter in that photograph. Otis told her, quietly and in broken pieces, about the day 3 years earlier, when a car exploded and took Diane and Reese's little daughter from him, told her that people had called it an accident, but no one in this house had ever believed those words, and that from that day on, the man who had once known how to laugh had died halfway, leaving behind only the cold part the whole city now feared. Maeve carried that story inside her for many days, and it changed the way she looked at Reese, because now when she saw him, she did not see only a boss, but a father, a husband who had lost everything, and had not known what to do with that pain, except build walls around himself. And perhaps because she understood him more deeply now, she dared to say what she said to him one February evening, while snow fell lightly beyond the window, and the two of them sat again at the kitchen table that had become a familiar place for their honest conversations. She told him she had heard about what was happening at the harbor, about the way Voss was tightening his grip around one small shop after another, about the Fontaine family's awning being slashed, about Widow Crane and the fear in her eyes, and she said that if each person was left to be broken separately, then soon no one would be standing at all. But if those small people were gathered together, if someone strong enough stepped forward to become their support, then things could be different. She said he had something Voss could not buy and could not threaten, and that was steadiness, and he could use it to crush others as he had for so long, or he could use it to shelter those who had nothing with which to defend themselves. Reese listened to her in silence for a long time, and she saw a struggle inside him, the struggle between the man he had become and another man. Her words were quietly calling back to life, and at last he said, his voice low and slow, that he had never thought of using what he had in that way. But he did it. A few days later, through the arrangement of Father Donnelly, the old priest of the little church near the harbor, a meeting was held in the room behind the church on a freezing evening, and the owners of small shops along the harbor came one after another, cautious, doubtful, many of them having never stood in the same room with Reese Calloway, and never having imagined they would one day do so. Maeve sat in the back row, quietly watching, and she saw Reese step to the front of the room, standing there for a moment in the candlelight of the old space, and when he spoke, his voice did not carry the cold edge she had known, but something she had never heard before, a bare sincerity. He told them he knew most of them had come because they were afraid, not because they trusted him, and he did not blame them for that. He said that for years, he had shut himself away on the hill beside the bay, had turned his back on the community his family had once been part of, had left everyone to fend for themselves while he drowned in his own grief, and he said he was sorry for that, sorry for being absent for so long. Then he said there was now a man trying to swallow all of them one by one, and that he would succeed if each person kept standing alone, but he would fail if they stood together, and he promised that if they dared to rise, he would stand with them, would use everything he had so that no one in that room would have to face Voss alone. There was a silence after he spoke, the silence of people who had just heard something they had not expected. And then Widow Crane, from one corner of the room, stood and said she had lived in the harbor longer than anyone there, and that for the first time in months, tonight she saw a reason to hope. One by one, they nodded. They agreed to stand together, and when the meeting ended, something in the air was different from when they had entered. Not quite optimism, because optimism was a luxury for people like them, but something more enduring than that, the realization that they were not alone. Maeve walked out of the church beside Reese, pulling her coat tight around her throat in the cold, her heart warmed by what she had just witnessed. But the moment they reached the steps, she stopped. Across the dark road, beneath the shadow of a row of bare trees, there was a car parked silently that she was certain had not been there when they went inside. A dark car with its engine still humming softly, and the rear window had been lowered halfway, revealing a blackness inside from which she could clearly feel a pair of eyes watching them. She took Reese's hand by instinct, and at that exact moment, the window slowly rose, and the car quietly rolled into the night, not hurried, not rushed, its calmness more frightening than any open threat, as though whoever sat inside wanted them to know that he had seen everything, and that he was afraid of nothing. The silent car in the night turned out to be only the prelude, because Voss was not the kind of man who would give a newly formed alliance time to take root, and his answer came faster than anyone had expected. Only a few days after the meeting at the church, on a night of strong wind, one of Reese's warehouses at the edge of the harbor caught fire, the flames licking up into the night sky and staining a whole stretch of water red. And by the time the fire was put out, nothing remained inside but a blackened frame, and the acrid smell of goods turned to ash. No one was hurt, because the warehouse was empty at that hour. But the message was as clear as if it had been written in fire across the sky. This is what I can do, and this is only the beginning. Then it was the smaller people's turn to suffer. One morning, they found the owner of a little repair shop along the harbor, a gentleman who had signed his name to the alliance, sitting dazed outside his shop with his arm tightly bandaged and a bruise across his face, his place torn apart. And all he could do was repeat that several men had come before dawn, that they had not said much, only left him a message written on his own body about the price of standing with Calloway. Maeve visited him with Reese, and she saw fear return to the eyes of the people who only days before had begun to show a flicker of hope, saw that fragile alliance sway like a candle in the wind. Even Reese's car, parked inside the grounds of the mansion that had seemed untouchable, was found one morning with all 4 tires slashed and a long scratch running down the length of its body, a violation inside his own stronghold, calculated to tell him that nowhere was safe, that Voss's hand could reach anywhere. The whole harbor held its breath, and in those days Maeve witnessed something she would never forget, the way Reese kept the alliance from falling apart. He did not make empty promises. He acted. He sent men to guard the shops of the most vulnerable families, quietly compensated people for the losses they had suffered, went in person to sit beside the shopkeeper who had been beaten, and told him he would not have to carry this alone, and little, by the steadiness of his presence, he kept those trembling people from scattering. Widow Crane told Maeve that she had lived through enough storms to know that what kept a tree from being torn out by the roots was not its strength alone, but the way its roots were woven into the roots of the trees beside it, and that for the first time, she saw this harbor having roots like that. But while everyone's attention was fixed on the harbor, on Voss's attacks from the outside, the true danger was lying quiet inside the house itself, and it was Cole, the young guard whom Maeve had noticed as quiet but with eyes that missed nothing, who touched it first. Late one evening, Cole came to Reese's study with a face tense in an unusual way, and he placed a photograph on the desk before him, a hurried picture, slightly blurred in the low light, but still clear enough to show what needed to be seen. Cole said he had been quietly watching the movements around the house since the poisoning, that something had kept troubling him, and that the afternoon before, he had followed one of the household staff when the man left the mansion with a flimsy excuse. In the photograph, beneath the sickly yellow light of a deserted street corner far from the house, Dale Hoffer was standing and speaking with 2 men both Cole and Reese recognized, 2 men belonging to Voss, and Hoffer's posture in the photograph was not that of someone being forced or cornered, but of a man exchanging, negotiating, belonging. Reese picked up the photograph, and Maeve, who had just brought coffee to the office door, stopped at the threshold and witnessed something she rarely saw in this man. She saw him go still, completely motionless, his eyes freezing over the picture, and in that silence there was something worse than anger, the deathly stillness of a man who had just realized that the knife making him bleed all this time had not come from an enemy outside the gate, but had been driven into his back by a hand he had still trusted, a hand that had been inside this house, sitting at his table, for so many years. Cole's photograph lit an urge in Maeve that she could not extinguish, because she understood that a blurred picture, no matter how suspicious, was not enough to accuse a person, and that if Hoffer truly was the traitor, they needed more than that. They needed one unbroken thread, tying everything together. And so, in the days that followed, between cooking and caring for her daughter, she quietly did something no one had assigned to her. She began piecing together a file, patiently and meticulously, the way she would set an unruly kitchen back in order. She wrote down everything she had witnessed, from the night she caught Hoffer photographing the meal schedule, to the times Reese had grown weak after dinner, to the scent in the wine glass, to the strange delivery man. She quietly asked the other servants harmless little questions disguised as idle talk, and she traced out that the wine delivery man who had been caught was in fact only the last link in the chain, A man hired to carry the crate to the door, not the one who had put the poison into it, because those bottles had been sitting in the house cellar for days before they were poured, and only someone inside the house, someone who could enter and leave the wine cellar without anyone bothering to notice, would have had the chance to switch a bottle or add something to it. And when she fitted that piece into its place, the picture that emerged was chillingly clear. The person who had poisoned Reese inside his own house was not an assassin who had broken in from outside, but Dale Hoffer, the man who had served this family for so long that no one, not even the most careful guards, had ever thought to check him, because long-held trust was the most perfect armor, and the most dangerous traitor was always the one people had stopped guarding against long ago. When Maeve brought what she had uncovered before Reese, he listened in silence as she laid it out, his face darkening with every word, and she saw in him the pain of a man forced to accept that his trust had been used against him beneath his own roof. But it was then that something no one expected happened, because Otis, who had been standing silently in the corner of the room, listening to every word, stepped forward with his limping gait, and from his coat pocket he took out something he had kept for a long time, a small crumpled scrap of paper, a receipt he had happened to pick up months before after Hoffer dropped it, a receipt for an item that had nothing to do with household work, and had been paid for with a sum far larger than any servant could have had. Otis's old hand trembled as he placed it on the desk, and he said, his voice tight with the remorse that had weighed on him for so long, that he had suspected something for a long time, that there had been small signs he had noticed, but had told himself he was imagining, because Hoffer had worked beside him for so many years, and he could not bear to believe that someone who had shared so many meals with him could betray them, and he had been afraid, terribly afraid of accusing an innocent man, so he had stayed silent, had kept this scrap of paper in his pocket, and not dared bring it forward. Then he looked up at Reese with tears gathering in his eyes, and he said the words Maeve knew would haunt him for the rest of his life, that if only he had spoken sooner, if only he had been brave enough to say something the day he found that paper, perhaps the young master would not have nearly lost his life, and he asked Reese to forgive the cowardice of an old man. Reese placed a hand on the old steward's shoulder and said nothing, but that gesture spoke for all of it. Meanwhile, Maeve, giving the two men a private moment, quietly gathered the documents spread across the desk, and as she collected the old papers Reese had taken from a locked drawer for comparison, her hand brushed another file, a folder yellowed by time that lay mixed underneath, and her eyes accidentally skimmed the words on the cover. It was the file on what people had called the accident 3 years before, the car explosion that had taken Diane and the little girl, and as her eyes moved down the notes beneath it, to a name mentioned as a lead once investigated, and then pushed aside, her fingers suddenly froze on the page, and she held her breath, because the name written there, the name connected to the car that had killed this man's family, was a name she had heard, a name that only recently had crossed the threshold of this house with the smile of a merchant. The name on that yellowed page was Garrett Voss, and in the moment Maeve recognized it. An entire stream of scattered details suddenly joined into one terrible thread. Voss's strange look at the family photograph, not the look of a man seeing it for the first time, but of one recognizing it. Widow Crane's whisper that he was not buying land but buying deaths too, all of it now taking on a chilling meaning. She brought the file to Reese and set it before him, pointing to the name, and she watched his face as he read, watched the moment truth drove itself through him. What the file recorded, stitched together with what Reese later uncovered through every resource he possessed, rebuilt a picture that could not be denied, that the car explosion 3 years earlier had never been an accident, but the first shot in a war Reese had not even known he was part of. A warning blow staged by Voss's own network in the early days, when he had first begun eyeing the harbor district, a ruthless message sent to the Calloway family to step back or pay the price. Only that fateful car, instead of carrying Reese as intended, had carried Diane and their little daughter, the man who had taken everything Reese loved, the man who had turned the man who once knew how to laugh into the cold statue the whole city feared, was the same man who had calmly walked into his drawing room with a cup of coffee and a smile, had sat only a few steps from the photograph of the people he had killed, and looked at them with the eyes of someone recognizing old victims. Reese said nothing through a silence so long it was frightening, and Maeve, standing beside him, could feel the rage rolling up inside him more clearly than if he had shouted, a deep, dark, ancient anger, the hunger for blood revenge anyone in his place would have felt, and she saw his hand clench into a fist on the desk, saw his jaw harden like stone around the scar. For many days after that, The anger hung over the house like a dark cloud, and Maeve understood that Rhys was standing before a crossroads, between the avenger his world demanded he become, and another man she had quietly called awake inside him. But right in the middle of that, while all attention was fixed on Voss and on the past now exposed, the pressure began to turn toward Maeve herself. One afternoon, when she went to the harbor market for groceries, she noticed a man lingering at just enough of a distance, appearing at the fish stall when she was at the fish stall, stopping to examine the vegetable stand when she was buying vegetables, a shadow following her quietly through the whole morning, and the instinct that had saved her so many times screamed again that she was being watched. Then a few days later, in the coat pocket she had hung in the hallway, she found a small folded note she was certain she had not put there, and when she opened it, she read a few brief handwritten lines, naming no one, making no open threat, only hinting that people who knew too much often did not live peacefully, that a wise woman would know how to keep silent for the sake of what she cherished, and that vagueness chilled her more than any direct threat could have. She brought the note to Rhys, and when he read it, she saw something decisive freeze in his eyes. He told her, his voice low and solid as steel, that he would not let anyone touch her or the child, that he would build a circle around them no one could break through. And she realized that the terror of losing the people he had once already lost was turning this man into something both frightening and deeply moving. As for Maeve, she stood before a choice. She could take her child and run from all this danger, or she could stay and fight. And she chose to stay. Not because she was reckless, but because she had understood that there are monsters running only teaches to chase, and that the only way for her daughter to be truly safe was to face and bring down the shadow stalking them. But as she sat alone in the kitchen that night, reading the note again and again beneath the light, something began to stir inside her, an uneasy discomfort with the handwriting itself, because the longer she looked, the more it seemed unlike what she imagined from a man like Voss. And worse than that, those slanted letters carried an inexplicable familiarity, as though she had seen them somewhere before, very close, right inside this house. The uneasy feeling about those written letters had not yet led Maeve anywhere when one night everything else moved aside, for a fear more primal than all the rest, because sometime after midnight she woke with a start to the sound of Penny's breathing, that broken, wheezing sound any mother with an asthmatic child recognizes instantly and never forgets. The little girl was sitting up in bed, her small shoulders rising and falling with each labored breath, and Maeve rushed to her side, searching for the familiar inhaler, but that night the attack came harder than usual, and she understood that her child needed more than what she had in her hands. She lifted Penny into her arms, and just then, Rhys appeared in the doorway, awakened by the noise, and instead of the awkward helplessness of a man faced with a sick child, he held an absolute calm, the kind of calm that now became a mercy. He told Maeve he would take them both right away, and he received Penny from her arms gently, carefully, as though lifting the most precious thing in the world, then held the little girl against his chest and moved down the stairs quickly but steadily, his deep, warm voice beside her ear the whole way, telling her to hold on to him, that everything would be all right, that he would take her somewhere people could help her breathe more easily. The car tore through the night toward the hospital, and Rhys, the man the whole city feared, carried the child through the bright corridors with an urgency Maeve had never seen in him before. And when the doctors took Penny from him, he stood there beside Maeve and did not leave, the two of them waiting together through that long, endless stretch of time every parent knows. Then Penny's breathing slowly evened out, color returned to her small face. The danger passed, and she was moved into a warm hospital room to rest, exhausted but safe. When Maeve dozed off in the chair beside the bed from sheer weariness, Rhys stayed awake beside the child, and Penny, waking in the night and seeing him there, smiled at him with the weak, trusting smile of childhood. She reached into the small bag her mother always carried for her, took out a drawing book with worn edges, and showed it to him, turning the pages one by one so he could see her pictures. And when she reached one page, she stopped, pointed at the drawing, and said it was her dream family. In that crooked little picture there was a big house beside blue water. There was her mother with red hair. There was Penny herself. And beside them, the tallest of all, was a man whose hair she had colored dark brown. And when Rhys asked softly who that man was, Penny looked up at him with clear eyes that held no doubt at all, pointed at him, and whispered, "It's you." Something broke open inside that man's chest in that moment, something he had locked away for 3 years. And for the first time since the day he lost everything, Reese Calloway cried, quietly, tears rolling down his hardened face in the dim light of the hospital room, while his large hand gently held the tiny hand of the child. That night, when they returned home, dawn was nearly breaking, and Reese did not go straight to his room. He walked to the end of the hallway, to the locked door he had not once had the courage to open in 3 years. The door Maeve had seen him place his hand on, and then draw back from in the night, and this time, with Penny's picture in his hand. He took the key from his pocket, slid it into the lock, and opened it. Inside was the room of the daughter he had lost, kept exactly as it had been on the final day, covered with the thin dust of time stopped still, old toys lying silent on the shelves, the small bed still made, and waiting for an owner who would never return, and Reese stepped into the middle of the keepsakes of the greatest pain of his life, standing there for a long time in silence, then gently placed Penny's drawing on the shelf beside the old toys, like a quiet bridge between a child who had been lost and a child who had just entered his life. And when he did, his eyes stopped on Diane's framed photograph on the table, and he picked it up. And it was then he realized that behind the picture, tucked between the frame and the backing, there was something he had never known was there, a small folded piece of paper his wife had hidden there at some point, waiting 3 years for someone to find it. Reese held that small folded paper in his hand for a long time without opening it, as though he was not yet ready to face whatever Diane had left for him, then quietly slipped it into the breast pocket of his coat, close to his heart, and stepped out of the room, saving it for another moment. Because right now there were more urgent matters tightening around them. Only a few days later, Cole brought back the news all of them had known would come sooner or later. The young guard had kept patiently tracking the movements of Voss's men, and he had discovered that Voss had chosen a specific night to make his final move, a plan calculated to end everything in a single blow. Voss intended to use forged papers, transfer documents, and ownership records crafted with great precision through the men he had bought to sweep in and seize Reese's crucial harbor warehouse district that very night, and at the same time crush the fragile alliance of shop owners by displaying enough force to frighten them into scattering. After hearing that plan, Maeve brought her worry about the familiar handwriting on the threatening note to Reese, and it was then that he finally told her the things he had kept hidden, and what he revealed left her stunned. He said the note aimed at her had not been written by someone under Voss's orders, but by Hoffer himself, in a panic when he felt he was close to being exposed. Hoffer had recklessly tried to silence her, in order to save himself, an act beyond any command, and the very fact that he had dared threaten an innocent woman, a woman who had treated him kindly in this house, had begun to crack something in the conscience he had believed he had buried long ago. But what astonished Maeve most was what Reese said next, because he admitted that he had known Hoffer had betrayed him, had known since the day Otis brought out the receipt and she finished piecing the file together, and yet all these days he had still left the man alone, still allowed him to believe he had not been uncovered, still allowed him to move in and out of the house and continue feeding information to Voss. Maeve asked him why he would allow a man who had nearly killed him to walk freely beneath his own roof, and Reese looked at her, then explained that he had done it for 2 reasons. The first was strategy, because an informant the enemy did not know had been exposed was the most valuable piece on the board, a channel through which he could feed Voss false information and make him confidently step into the trap Reese was quietly setting. But the second reason, the one that truly left Maeve silent, was what he said after that he had also left Hoffer alone, because he wanted to give the man a path, a chance to choose again for himself. He said Hoffer had wandered too far, had sold his loyalty out of fear and bitterness, but he still saw something in him that had not completely died, and he wanted to see, when the man stood before the final line, which side he would choose. Maeve looked at the man before her, the man who only a few months earlier had been a block of cold ice who knew only punishment, and she realized that the words she had planted in him that night in the kitchen about seeing people as true human beings had taken root, had grown into something she had not expected. He was silent for a while, looking out the window where the bay was darkening in the evening light. Then he said softly, almost to himself, that everyone deserved one chance in life to choose again, even the man who had betrayed him, and that perhaps this was something no one had ever given him, so he wanted to try giving it to someone else, if only once, to see whether mercy was a foolish luxury or the only thing that could still save a human being. On the night before the fateful night Voss had chosen, the house by the bay sank into an unusual stillness, the heavy stillness of the moment before a storm, when all things seemed to hold their breath and wait. Every preparation had been made. Every call that needed to be made had been made. Every person who needed to be present had been told. And now there was nothing left to do but wait. And waiting is always the hardest part. Maeve had lulled Penny to sleep, and the little girl lay there in her warm room, her small chest rising and falling evenly after the asthma attack had passed, her face carrying the peace of a child who had no idea of the dangers circling the roof above her. And Maeve stood beside her bed for a long time, only to watch her breathe, only to remind herself that everything she did was for that peaceful face. When she went down to the kitchen, she found Rhys already sitting there at the familiar table, not to discuss the plan, but simply sitting, with 2 cups of coffee already made, one for him and one for her, as though he had known she would come down. They sat together in the warm yellow light of the kitchen, and for a long while neither of them said anything. The silence between them now so different from the suffocating silence of the early days. It had become a comfortable silence, the silence of 2 people who had walked through enough together that they no longer needed to fill every empty space with words. Then Rhys spoke softly, saying he had forgotten what it felt like for a house to truly have people living in it, had forgotten the sound of a child's footsteps on the stairs, the smell of bread baking in the morning, the kitchen light glowing when he came home late from work, had forgotten that those small, ordinary things were what made a home, not walls or rooms. He said that for 3 years he had lived inside a shell, not a house, and that only when she stepped in with her old bag and her little daughter had this place begun to breathe again. Maeve listened to him, and she felt something rise in her chest, a tenderness she had forbidden herself to feel for a very long time, and in that moment, beneath the warm light, the 2 of them sat very close together, close enough that she could see both the weariness and the softening in his gray eyes, and something wordless passed between them, an understanding deeper than any touch, the kind of moment when both people know that something has changed forever between them, even though neither dares name it aloud. Rhys looked around the kitchen, at the place that had come back to life beneath her hands, then said that whatever happened tomorrow night, he wanted her to know that these past months had been the first time in a very long while that he had felt alive, and she understood that this was the closest thing to a confession that a man like him could ever speak. But that night, after Rhys had gone upstairs and the house had fallen completely quiet, Maeve remained alone in the kitchen, and she took from the cabinet drawer something she had quietly hidden there, 2 bus tickets. She had bought them a few days earlier, not to run away in the middle of danger, because she had chosen to stay and fight, and she would not leave before everything was settled, but as a plan for afterward, for the day when it was all over, and she was free again, because deep inside, Maeve still carried an old uncertainty, the self-respect that had followed her through a lifetime of hardship, whispering to her that she did not want to remain in this house as a debt of gratitude, did not want Penny to grow up, and one day understand that her mother had clung to a man because she had nowhere else to go, and that perhaps, once Voss had been brought down and her daughter was safe, the right thing to do would be to walk away on her own 2 feet, to preserve the last dignity she had. She held the 2 tickets in her hands for a long time, her fingers lightly brushing over the paper, then folded them and tucked them into the very bottom of the old bag that had followed her through so many roads, and she lifted her eyes, looking for a long time toward the staircase leading up to the room where her daughter slept peacefully, her heart heavy with a question she did not yet dare answer, whether, when that day came, she would have the courage to leave a place that had begun to feel more like home than anywhere she had ever known. That fateful night arrived under a moonless sky and a thin mist crawling up from the surface of the bay, and Voss appeared at the harbor warehouses exactly as Cole had reported, calm and confident, sitting in his sleek car with a stack of forged documents in his hand and a group of powerful men behind him, certain that tonight he would end everything and swallow whole the stretch of harbor he had long coveted. But when he stepped out of the car and moved toward the warehouses beneath the yellowish light of the old lampposts, he stopped short, because what he saw was not an empty harbor waiting to be seized. Instead, standing there waiting for him was the entire alliance of small shop owners he had believed frightened enough to fall apart. The Fontaine family, Widow Crane, the repair shop owner who had once been beaten, all of them standing quietly but firmly, no longer isolated individuals, but a single body. Beside them stood a woman Maeve had never met, a lawyer named Portia Kessler, holding a thick file in her hands. And there, stepping out from the shadow of the cargo stacks, was a man wearing a federal badge, Agent Hale Merrick, along with his people, the ones who had quietly cast their net around the harbor hours earlier. Voss looked around, and Maeve, standing close beside Reese at a safe distance, saw the confident smile on his face harden. Kessler stepped forward, and in a calm voice without the slightest hesitation, she began reading out what the file contained. The very file Maeve had patiently built over so many nights, copied into several sets, and sent long ago into the hands of people outside Voss's reach. She exposed the poisoning inside the Calloway house, the extortion payments forced from the shops, the warehouse fire, the beatings, and then the heaviest thing of all, the car explosion 3 years earlier that had taken 2 innocent lives. All of it linked into one chain of evidence pointing straight at Voss. He tried to give a cold little laugh, opened his mouth to deny it, to call it slander without proof. But in that very moment, something no one among his men had expected took place. From behind them, Dale Hoffer stepped out of the ranks, his face pale and torn, and before everyone's stunned eyes, he began to speak, his voice trembling at first but growing steadier with every word. He confessed his own role, confessed that he had been the one to put the poison into the wine, that he had been the one feeding information to Voss, and then he turned and pointed straight at Voss, laying out every order, every meeting, every dirty dollar, placing on the scale everything he knew. He said he had gone too far, that the day he dared threaten an innocent woman and child in that house, he had realized what he had become, and he could no longer live beneath that weight. Voss looked at him with the eyes of a betrayed beast, but then, instead of collapsing, he let out a cold, quiet laugh, and said they were naive if they thought he had come empty-handed, that he still had one card no one had accounted for. At that exact moment, a man in an official uniform stepped forward from the rear, an official Voss had bought long ago to overturn the board at the final minute, and Voss triumphantly ordered him to arrest them all, but the official did not move, because Merrick had stepped forward, calm and composed, and he informed Voss that his final card had been turned over weeks ago, that the very man he believed was his own piece had already been discovered and placed under federal watch, and that now the man he had planned to use as his escape had become one more link in the chain against him. The smile vanished completely from Voss's face, and the illusion of invincible power on which he had built his entire career shattered before his eyes. The men who followed him began backing away, surrendering one by one as they realized the ship had already sunk. When the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Voss turned his head to find Reese in the crowd, and amid the chaos of his defeat, he looked straight into the eyes of the man upon whom he had inflicted so much suffering, and with one final cruelty, he said softly, just loud enough for Reese to hear, that the car that night 3 years ago had been meant for him, and that it was such a pity the people sitting inside had not been him, confirming in an icy voice the truth Reese had only just learned, like one last knife driven into a wound that had not yet begun to close. Voss's final cruel words hung in the cold air of the harbor, and Maeve saw Reese's whole body go rigid, saw that ancient rage surge back through him, the hunger to rush forward and strangle the man who had taken everything he loved, and for one breathless moment she did not know what he would do. But Reese did not move. He only stood there, looking straight into Voss's eyes, and let the moment pass, let Merrick's men lead him away, because he had understood something tonight had taught him, that the heaviest punishment for a man like Voss was not death by Reese's hand, which would only turn Reese into a version of the very man he hated, but to be exposed before everyone, stripped bare of the power he worshipped, and locked in a place where money could not buy freedom. Around them, Voss's empire was collapsing in exactly the way empires built on fear always collapse, swiftly and without mercy, because the men who followed him had never truly been loyal to him, only loyal to the illusion that he could not be defeated. And now that the illusion had shattered, one by one they dropped their weapons, raised their hands in surrender, some turning to confess in order to save themselves, the tower that had seemed untouchable falling in a single night, without a single bullet needing to be fired. Merrick came to Reese and told him that with all the evidence in hand, Voss would face enough federal charges to keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life, and that once the things he had done in other places were connected, every door of escape would be sealed shut. But amid all the chaos and relief of that moment of victory, there was one scene Maeve would remember forever. When the federal men prepared to take Dale Hoffer away, he stopped as he passed Reese, and for a moment the two men looked at one another, the betrayer and the betrayed, and Maeve waited for contempt, waited for the bitter words Hoffer deserved to receive. But Hoffer only lifted his head and looked at Reese with reddened eyes, and he said, his voice breaking, that he knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness, that what he had done could never be redeemed, but he wanted Reese to know that the last chance Reese had quietly given him, the way he had left Hoffer free to choose instead of disposing of him as the underworld code demanded, had saved the final human part still left inside him, and that he would carry that gratitude into the years of prison ahead. Reese looked at him for a long time, and Maeve saw his jaw move, saw the struggle inside him between the pain of betrayal and something larger. And at last he said softly that he did not forgive what Hoffer had done. Perhaps he never would, but he would not curse him either, because he had learned that carrying hatred only made a person heavier, and he was tired enough of that weight already. Hoffer nodded, tears running down his face, then allowed himself to be led away, and the way he walked, his back a little straighter than when he had been arrested, said that no matter how low a person had fallen, he could still find one fragment of dignity again if someone was willing to believe he was still worthy of it. When they returned to the house by the bay near dawn, the silence that settled around them was no longer the deathly silence of the old days, but the quiet of a storm that had passed. And Maeve carried Penny, who had spent the night dozing in Cole's arms in a safe place, up to bed. That night, as she walked along the upstairs hallway toward her own room, she stopped, because she saw something she knew she would never forget. The door at the end of the hall, the door to the room of the daughter he had lost, the door that had been locked for 3 long years and that Reese had only just found the courage to open, was no longer closed now, but left ajar, slightly open to receive the last moonlight of the night. And inside, she could see that Reese had fallen asleep in the chair beside the small bed. His face, for the first time since she had known him, relaxed into peace and sleep, like the face of a man who had finally set down something he had carried for far too long. Spring came to Baltimore Bay in its slow and hesitant way, the ice gradually melting along the water's edge, the first new buds pushing up beside the paths, and with spring came a Reese Calloway, whom the whole city slowly began to recognize as changed. In the weeks after that night at the harbor, he began doing something no one had ever thought a man in his position would do. He began dismantling the very empire his father had left behind, and that he himself had preserved for so many years. He converted the transport routes, the docks, the warehouses, into a legitimate and transparent shipping company, cutting away the shadow dealings that had once fed the Calloway family. And he did it quietly, firmly, one step at a time, exactly the way Maeve had once cleaned an abandoned kitchen, removing what had rotted so what remained could live. He used his immense fortune to compensate the families who had suffered under Voss's hand, repaired the burned warehouse for the shop owners, quietly cared for those who had been forced to pay that cruel insurance fee, and the entire harbor, long accustomed to looking at the Calloway name with caution, slowly began to look at him in another way, the way people look at someone who has chosen to use his strength to build instead of to rule. But the thing that truly changed Reese, the thing at the root of all those choices, was something Maeve did not learn until a quiet spring evening. That night, after dinner, when Penny was asleep and the house had grown still, Reese came to her in the kitchen, holding the small folded paper he had found behind Diane's photograph on the night he reopened the room, the paper he had kept close to his heart for weeks without having the courage to open it. He told Maeve he wanted her beside him when he read it, and she understood what a great act of trust that was. He opened the paper with hands that trembled slightly, and he read, his voice low and slowly breaking with each line. It was an unfinished letter Diane had written to him on some ordinary afternoon before everything happened. A letter from a wife who understood her husband better than he understood himself, and in it she had written that she knew he carried darkness inside him, a tendency to close himself off and turn pain into anger. And she begged him, if one day she was no longer beside him, please not to let his heart die with her, not to lock it away in dark rooms, and above all, never to answer one loss by causing more loss, because that road had no end and would swallow the good man she had loved. When Reese reached those lines, Maeve understood that this letter, this plea from the woman who was gone, had been what held his hand back at the harbor, the voice that had stopped him from becoming the man Voss had nearly turned him into, and she realized that the woman in the photograph, though she had been gone for 3 years, had still managed to save her husband one last time. Reese stopped, his throat tight, and Maeve placed her hand over his, a simple gesture that held everything she did not know how to say. Then he lowered his eyes and read the final part, and there, beneath the unfinished lines, Diane had added a postscript, as though some faint intuition had whispered to her. She had written that this house was too large and too warm to be left in coldness, that one day, when he was ready, he should let someone step into it again, should let love find its way back into the rooms, because keeping a heart sealed shut was not how the living honored the dead, but continuing to live and continuing to love was. Reese finished the final line and went silent for a long time, then slowly lifted his head, and his eyes found Maeve, resting on her face beneath the warm kitchen light, a gaze carrying both a question he did not yet dare speak and an answer that perhaps Diane, from some faraway place, had gently written for them both. The look Reese had given her that night, the wordless question hanging between them beneath the kitchen light, followed Maeve through the days that came after and left her heart more tangled than ever, because now she could no longer lie to herself that what was growing between her and that man was only gratitude or shared sorrow. She carried the 2 bus tickets at the bottom of her bag like an unanswered question, a symbol of the road her old self-respect kept whispering she should choose, and she hesitated between 2 paths, no longer knowing which one was truly right for herself and for her daughter. It was on one such spring morning, while Maeve was alone in the kitchen, and early sunlight poured golden through the window, that Otis came to her, and he did something rare. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, placed his old hands together on the table, and looked at her with the eyes that had watched this house for 30 years. He told her he had served the Calloway family longer than many people lived entire lives, that he had witnessed this house through its golden days, when laughter still rang through the halls, then watched it darken after that fateful day. I watched the lights go out one room at a time, until the vast estate was nothing more than a cold shell, where a lonely man moved like a ghost among his own memories. He said he had stayed through all those dark years, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had stubbornly believed this house would one day find its way back to itself, if only one person stayed long enough to wait for the light to return. Then he looked at Maeve, and his voice softened. He said she had stepped through that door on a rainy night with an old bag and a little child, and in only a few short months, the light he had waited for all those years had come back. Not the light from lamps, but another kind of light, the kind that turns a house into a home. And he wanted her to know that he had seen it, had seen the young master come back to life little by little in her presence, had seen laughter return to this kitchen, had seen the door once locked shut finally opened. Maeve listened to him, and she felt her throat tighten, because his words had touched the very thing she had been trying to avoid, and she spoke softly to him about her uncertainty, about the self-respect that would not let her stay as a debt of gratitude, about her fear that she would only be staying because she had nowhere else to go. Otis listened, nodding slowly, then smiled, the kind smile of an old man who had understood human hearts through many years, and he told her he understood that worry, but he thought she had mistaken the nature of the matter, because staying because one is needed, and staying because one is loved, are 2 entirely different things, and she had confused them as one. Then he leaned forward a little, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. Then he told her that he understood Reese Calloway better than anyone still alive in this world, and he knew one thing with certainty, that man, no matter how wide his heart had opened to her, would never be the one to speak first, because he had lost too much and feared too deeply the thought of reaching out once more only for fate to tear it from his hands again. So he would keep standing at the edge without daring to step forward, would wait in silence until it was too late. And Otis looked straight into her eyes, his smile still lingering at the corner of his mouth, but his gaze serious and earnest, and said that perhaps this time she would have to be the one brave enough to decide for both of them, because there are doors in life that will remain closed forever, if one keeps waiting for the person on the other side to open them first. Otis's words followed Maeve for many days, and finally, on an early summer evening when the sunset turned the whole surface of Baltimore Bay gold, she found the courage to face the thing she had kept avoiding. Only it was Reese who suggested that the 2 of them walk out to the pier, as though he too had reached a decision of his own. They walked beside each other over the old wooden planks leading out above the water, the last light of day spreading a gleaming golden carpet across the bay, the sea wind blowing gently with the taste of salt and the scent of approaching summer. And in Maeve's coat pocket, at the very bottom, were still the 2 bus tickets she had kept for so many weeks. 2 tickets for a journey some part of her still believed she ought to take. She had meant to tell him that, had meant to confess that she thought she should leave, not because she wanted to, but because the self-respect that had followed her through a lifetime of hardship kept whispering that she could not stay in this house as an act of charity, could not let her daughter grow up with the thought that her mother had clung to a man simply because she had nowhere else to go. But before she could speak, Reese stopped at the end of the pier, and he said something that made every word she had prepared disappear. He said he knew she still carried an uncertainty inside her, that he had seen it in her eyes many times, and that he did not want her to remain here because she felt indebted, because she was afraid, or because she had no other choice. Then he handed her an envelope, and inside were papers confirming that every old debt that had weighed on her shoulders, the debts her former husband had left behind and that had followed her for years, had been paid in full by him, wiped clean, with no condition attached. He told her that now she was completely free, that she could take Penny anywhere she wanted, begin a new life in a place where no one knew the Calloway name, and that he would not hold her back, would not use anything to bind her, because he had learned that loving someone did not mean holding tightly to them, but giving them the freedom to choose. Maeve stood there with the envelope in her hand, and tears rose in her eyes, because she understood that in giving her the road to leave, he had removed the only reason she had wanted to leave. She realized that if she stayed now, it would no longer be because she was indebted or trapped, but because she truly chose this place, chose this man. And so, beneath the blazing golden sunset, Maeve took the 2 bus tickets from her pocket, looked at them one final time, then tore them in half and let the scraps of paper fly away in the sea wind. She lifted her eyes to him, and she said she was staying, not because she had to stay, but because she wanted to stay, and that was the difference of an entire lifetime. Rhys looked at her, and on that once hardened face there was now a tenderness he had thought he had lost forever. And he told her that he had enough money to buy almost anything in the world, but she was the one thing he never wanted to own. He only wanted to be beside her, reminding her that the house had been dark and cold for 3 years until she walked in and lit it back to life, and that he would rather spend the rest of his life with her in that house than have everything else in the world without her. Just then, Penny's clear laughter rang out as the little girl ran toward them along the pier, her small feet skipping over the wooden planks, her hair flying in the evening light, and she rushed between them, taking her mother's hand and Rhys's hand, pulling them closer together. And in that moment, the 3 of them standing together at the end of the pier beneath the setting sun no longer looked like 3 separate broken lives, but like something whole, a family that had found one another amid the ruins of Leeds. The story of Maeve and Rhys reminds us that the value of a person does not lie in the power or wealth they possess, but in the heart that knows how to see others as real human beings, that enduring kindness can warm even hearts that seem to have turned to stone, that forgiveness does not mean forgetting pain, but choosing to set down the burden of hatred so we can keep walking, and that the truest love is when we give the person we love the freedom to choose, instead of holding them tightly in our hands. Sometimes what heals a broken soul is not time, but the kind presence of someone brave enough to step into the cold house of our heart and gently light the lamp again. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share, so we can continue listening together to many meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Maeve and Rhys's journey, and what part of the story moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your honest emotions. We wish everyone listening to this story abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.